Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we are rolling up our sleeves and digging into a highly critical, really widely discussed recent analysis of Donald Trump's administration. This one comes from political and economic commentator Richard J. Murphy. Now, our goal here isn't to agree or disagree, but to map out the exact architecture of his critique. We want to break down exactly how he builds his argument step by step using the specific evidence he brings to the table. Let's dive right in. And that brings us straight to the central thesis of Murphy's whole analysis. He says, quote, Trump the dealmaker is becoming Trump the serial failure. According to Murphy, this administration is totally defined by a pattern of these grand, sweeping public claims that are then followed by rapid, really quiet reversals. He uses this alleged pattern to build a case that the administration is experiencing a systemic collapse across basically everything, both domestic and international fronts. So here is the thematic roadmap we're going to use to examine his case today. We'll start with the core argument, move into foreign policy reversals, examine claims of domestic chaos, look at a fascinating historical comparison to Richard Nixon, and then finally unpack the broad economic lesson he draws from the whole shebang. All right, starting off with Section 1, the core argument, and what the source actually identifies as the administration's sole stated success. Before he gets into the alleged failures, Murphy kind of establishes a baseline. According to his analysis, every flagship promise made by the administration is either failing outright or just contradicting itself. But he says there is one major exception. He argues that the absolute only consistently delivered objective is tax cuts for the wealthy. In his view, nothing else of substance is actually crossing the finish line. That foundational claim takes us right into Section 2, foreign policy reversals. This is where Murphy puts international diplomacy under the microscope, weighing those grand claims against the actual outcomes. His first example perfectly illustrates this idea of grand claim versus quiet collapse. First, you have the administration's claim, right? An imminent breakthrough deal with Iran, mediated by Oman to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. It was supposed to be a massive diplomatic win. But then you look at the outcome. According to the source, Iran actually hardened its position with demands they fully knew Washington wouldn't accept. The U.S. rejected them, the strait remains closed, and that promised diplomatic success, well, it just kind of faded away. And he applies that exact same framework to a second example, this time regarding Gaza. First came the big public announcement claiming that Hamas had agreed to a deal to disarm. Huge news, right? But then came the reality check. The source notes that Hamas had attached a massive precondition to this. They required full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Unsurprisingly, Israel rejected those terms entirely, and the deal vanished instantly. Murphy asserts that this sort of rapid collapse severely, literally, chips away at U.S. credibility on the global stage. Now, the third diplomatic example he provides is honestly perhaps the most unconventional. The speaker details a domestic nuclear energy deal that was signed with Saudi Arabia. However, the very next day, a new clause was allegedly added, via a social media post. This new clause required Saudi Arabia to recognize Israel. According to Murphy, Riyadh reacted incredibly poorly to this attempt to basically rewrite diplomacy on a social media feed. He concludes that confidence was completely destroyed and the deal is effectively dead, which he argues shows a profound misunderstanding of how international relations actually work. Okay, let's see how this pattern builds as his critique shifts focus from the global stage to local, domestic projects in Section 3, domestic chaos. This story brilliantly illustrates the creator's view of self-inflicted incompetence. He uses the Washington reflecting pool almost like a microcosm for the whole administration. So, step 1, they drain and reline the pool to fix a pesky algae problem. Step 2, absolute disaster strikes. The algae returns immediately, and the brand new lining just starts peeling off. Step 3, instead of taking responsibility, the administration blames vandals, arresting people and threatening them with literally 10-year prison terms. Finally, step 4, the administration's own officials quietly abandon the charges, admitting the construction contract simply backfired and it was just bad work. The source highlights this to ask a really pointed question. If they can't even manage a swimming pool, how on earth can they manage a country? Beyond the reflecting pool, the analysis just rattles off this rapid-fire list of alleged government struggles to emphasize a sense of widespread disruption. He points to halted White House building work, continuous court interventions blocking administrative plans, and profound chaos in migration policy, specifically citing arrests without cause and ICE violence. He also notes blocked military promotions targeting women and people of color, plus controversial medical cuts looming in January. Murphy packages all these points together to argue that basic, fundamental administrative competence is just completely absent. Which brings us to Section 4, the Nixon comparison, where he places this record into a much broader historical context. Murphy deliberately ties his critique to the anniversary of Richard Nixon's 1974 resignation over Watergate. It's a really fascinating juxtaposition. On one hand, you have Nixon's fall, which Murphy categorizes as being driven by lies and petty criminality, but crucially, he notes it was largely a contained domestic scandal. He contrasts this with his assessment of the current administration's record, which he argues is actually far worse. He claims the current administration displays a much wider global impact, causes significantly greater damage, and evidences a systemic form of corruption that democracies absolutely must actively reject. So, you might be wondering, why is all of this happening? We explore the source's answer in Section 5, the broad lesson, Challenging Neoliberal Economics. The creator's ultimate argument boils down to a pretty simple premise. Business deal-making is not the same as governing. Nations cannot be managed like private companies. Murphy strongly asserts the public administration requires entirely different skills than running a private fiefdom. He argues that this administration proves, once and for all, that the logic of relying on market forces and business tactics to somehow solve national problems is just fundamentally flawed. And this leads us to what he views as the real enemy in his analysis, neoliberalism. Now, in the context of the source's argument, neoliberalism is the economic and political logic that prioritizes market forces and private administration styles above absolutely everything else. Murphy explicitly claims that Trump is an arch-neoliberal and that his track record of alleged failures is the ultimate, undeniable proof that neoliberal logic is completely broken and needs to be consigned to history. Finally, the source maps out the global ramifications of this argument. Murphy insists, very clearly, that this isn't just an American problem. He points to a highly unstable U.S. political landscape ahead of the midterms, sure, but he immediately connects it to UK politics, citing figures like Nigel Farage, who he claims personify this exact same political style across the pond. He notes that the UK Labour Party is struggling to offer a real alternative, leaving groups like the Greens and pro-independence parties to step up and try to build new, non-neoliberal narratives. Which brings us to the final, really provocative thought the source leaves his audience with. How do we get rid of this politics? And what replaces it? By systematically mapping out what he sees as serial failure, Murphy isn't just criticizing a single administration. He is directly challenging you, the viewer, to envision a completely new framework for global governance. And look, regardless of where you stand politically, understanding how a specific critique like this is structured helps us all better navigate the massive conversations happening in the world today. So, what do you think the answer to his question is? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.